Welcome to the C-Suite Marketing Perspectives podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host, and we have on today Polo Aristoy. Now, Polo has a really unique background in both B2C and B2B. Polo, you were actually an analyst and you consulted with B2C and B2B companies from Procter Gamble on when you were at Nielsen. Right. You've been the CMO of a professional soccer team. You're advising the Soccer Federation right now. You've worked with FinTech, credit clouds, the B2B world. So you've got this really interesting background, which leads to some pretty interesting insights. But before we get into that, tell us just a little bit more about your background and what you've done before we kind of jump into the conversation here.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Steve. And you're not wrong. It's been an interesting career so far. It's not necessarily all by design. It's been a little bit at times by opportunities that come up. At times, M&A and acquisition from where I sit and the companies that I work with. And yeah, indeed, I started as an analyst and consultant at first with Procter Gamble and Nielsen. And then I moved into the media world and entertainment, working for some big players there, ESPN, DirecTV. And then more recently, like you said, I've dedicated my more recent years, especially since COVID, working with smaller and early stage companies, most of them B2B, and advising them on setting up a marketing roadmap. So it's been colorful. I would say that it challenges me in a couple different ways. On the one hand, because everything is contextual and you have to be constantly switching from context depending on the vertical that you're working in. But at the same time, I think of it as an advantage because often I will find that I will bring a learning from either a category, a company, or just a different space. And if I can make sense of it and tell that story, often it can resonate and impact the way the company is looking at something. So best practices, so to speak, and knowledge sharing is it's now turned out to be a positive for me. So it's been interesting.
Well, you and I, when we've been talking, there's similarities in how to approach B2C and B2B, but you talked about how B2B is much more complex than B2C. And therefore it actually accentuates some of the things that we kind of have and we hold as true and dear in the B2C world in terms of how we do marketing. But explain a little bit more, if you can, about your perspective on those complexities for B2B marketers, what that means. We're talking overall, the theme here is why CMOs need a little bit more B2C in their B2B, right?
Correct.
But start us out with that kind of that complexity notion that you have.
Well, and I think you have touched on this in recent episodes of your podcast, which is the life of a CMO and the shelf life, the span of the tenure of a CMO is getting shorter. And in a big way, it's because the expectations from the CMO position continue to increase. But then the definition of what we expect from that CMO position from marketing is also vastly different between B2C and B2B. So in the case of B2B, there is a catch-all that the CMO and marketing sort of are expected to play out. So it's not uncommon on the B2B side, from a marketing perspective, to be very task-oriented. So, how's our website doing? What is the data telling us? We need a YouTube. Somebody says, the competition is doing this other thing. So you're constantly working behind tasks. And really, instead of being very strategic in your approach, you're really just all the time going full speed, trying to meet those tasks and stay above water. So that makes it a very utilitarian approach to marketing. And it really impacts the brand, I think. So that's one thing that's impacting, CMOs and marketing within the B2B space. I think that from the set needs to be understood and aligned internally. This decision sits with the CEO or the founder. The CEO figure has to understand and has to be very clear on their expectations of what marketing needs to do in their company. And again, I think the definition of that in B2B is a lot more varied and a lot more up to, up for grabs, so to speak, than B2C. Like I told you at some point, I think that in B2C, marketing has a big seat at the table. And in B2B, that table is shared with a lot more players, right? And sometimes with bigger seats in the name of sales, success, product marketing. So it's a more diluted conversation in B2B that makes it a much more undefined, but at the same time, very, the expectations are really high with marketing. So it makes it a very complex proposition in B2B and a little bit more tasking than it is in B2C, where the expectation and the position of marketing is a lot more clear and understood. I think that's one fundamental difference between the two business models.
Yeah, in B2C world, marketing is king, right? It's much more short decision-making processes. There's not big buying groups, right? There's impulse purchases, so the stimulation by marketing, the demand generation, marketing has an elevated role.
Correct. Yeah.
But you talk about, you talk about complexity in the buying. You talk about complexity and the level of risk on the B2B side. How does that impact the way that you're thinking about it and this balance of these two worlds and how that comes together in the marketing mix for a B2B marketer?
Yeah. Well, I think this dives into another big difference, so to speak, between the approach marketing can have in B2B and B2C. So who owns the voice of the customer, right? Who owns that? Not only in terms of bringing up in meetings at the table what the customer is saying, feeling, or complaining about, but ultimately who owns the function of it and whatever resources, methodologies, or whatever, how rich the information we can get from that point of view. I think any marketing and even salespeople here in this call, that can listen to us will empathize with the idea that many times, especially in B2B, you will be sitting at a table and the head of sales will say, yeah, I just talked to so-and-so client or so-and-so prospect, and they're complaining about this. It's one anecdote, one conversation, but from that standpoint, it just becomes a little bit of gospel and direction. And that's not necessarily backed up by the data or representative or your customer set, but that anecdote somehow takes a life of its own, and then it becomes a directive. In better, more disciplined companies, this should be understood as one anecdote and something that we need to then validate through data and essentially really see, what the customer need is, or what the complaint, or what the product feature we need to address, and so on, as opposed to just one anecdotal point of view can impact the strategy. So I think the voice of the customer is crucial to not only how you approach marketing, but then in B2B environments is who owns that conversation. I think that's, again, that's a conversation that we need to align on, all of us at the table, but also that we need to define who owns that and why. I think in B2B environments, less so than B2C, marketing is a little bit weakened by that because not always are we the owners of the voice of the consumer, the voice of the customer.
Yeah, all the big analyst firms, right, talk about how CMOs need to be more chief customer officers.
Yeah.
And it's because they need to tap into in a deep way that voice, right? And
correct.
That voice is the highest authority in the company, right? The B2C is really good at that. Like, the customer is the boss. Right. That was at one point a Procter Gamble slogan.
Correct.
Like on Tide and things like that. But in the B2B world, there's no difference, right? The customer, the buyer is the boss, right? So who's representing that? Who has that voice? And who has that voice if you're on and you're talking and you're, getting the insights and from the customers on a regular basis in marketing, guess what? You have really great input for product marketing. Right? And insights, you have really great input for customer success, for sales, right? Because you see the thread, the line that runs through, and like, hey, it's not just that one anecdote you're talking about. there is a commonality to what
Yeah.
we're finding here, right? That means you are a valued service to every other department.
Yeah.
That is a role that is underplayed. I think that's what I'm taking away from your conversation here. And what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And this is fascinating to me because, so let's take the funnel, right? The proverbial funnel. We sometimes imagine that because we can relatively see a customer or a client, a prospect, walk or go through the funnel, we believe that it's a very linear process.
Right.
So in other words, let's say that we, marketing and B2B, we generate and we are, very, very dedicated towards top of the funnel and then nurturing down. And then success or sales or onboarding starts, grabbing at mid funnel towards conversion and so on. We can simplistically imagine that this is one single pathway, a linear pathway, and also one person that's going through this funnel. And so by the time, say, success or sales has that interaction midway through or closer to conversion, there is already an assumption that it is that person that we're talking about or that we're talking to has already single-handedly walked through the funnel. But there might be that this person is either the first or second interaction with a company or with a product or with a new feature or what have you. So the simplicity of message and the consistency of message throughout the funnel becomes a lot more important than we give it credit for. Again, because the expectations might be very different. Mm-hmm. There's two also additional differences there. There's a buying process and then there's a selling process. So somebody that's already, if we're already in their consideration set, they're in a buying process and their expectations and knowledge of what they want, even if they're wrong, but what they think they want is one. And if we're doing a fully outbound effort and we're selling, there might be less knowledgeable. And so this is critical to understand. Like the example can be essentially that, we present a certain expertise, our product presents a certain solution. And the client, whoever that buying person is, whether it's IT, procurement, the CMO of that company, whoever that is, they are expecting to speak with an expert. And they consider us expert in our product and in our market. But the salesperson or the customer success person might not be the expert. They're just doing their job. They're just a salesperson. And so the expectation, again, to delivery might be a little bit different. And so going back to the funnel and the idea of the funnel, it's not necessarily always a very linear process. And so what we have to do from a marketing, from a customer experience perspective is be very clean, very simple, very succinct in the messaging that we deliver at every step. And that helps with consistency, that helps with our positioning, but that also helps address whatever expectation that that possible customer persona is coming to us with. And I think that's not necessarily always understood. We make the assumption, right? And as humans, we make assumptions all the time, but we make the assumption that that person already knows everything or has been exposed to all of our material. And we don't ask enough questions. And so I think that curating, but that also dedication to consistent messaging is critical in B2B. But again, it's not something that's always priority because of who owns that voice of the customer. And I think it should be marketing.
Yeah. And, you make a really good point here is that as marketers, we live with our message every day. We get tired of it. Right? I mean,
yes,
it's such a part of what we do. But with our buyers, it's such a small sliver of what they have to know and consider, right? And so repetition, from B2C marketing, right? You do television flights at the 3+ frequency reach because then it needs repetition. There's no difference in that in the B2B buyer, right?
Correct.
Like you referenced the series that we do on why B2B CMOs fail so quickly. We're on part 5. We're going to do over 10, maybe even 15.
Yeah,
it'll become an ebook and everything, but there's no one person that's going to consume all that, right? But maybe 2, 3 over the course of 6 months, right? that's gonna resonate with them. Where if we said, oh geez, we're not saying the same thing, but it's the same message, 15 different times, why would we do that?
Yeah.
Right? Well, it's because what you're talking about here, right? We can't get tired of our own messages, right? We have to keep learning so that there are different angles with the same message that we can bring to the marketplace, right?
Correct.
That seem unique and new. But I'm dying to get to the point where I think this is one of the critical parts of our conversation here. Okay. And that was that you talk about that more emotion in B2B marketing and selling is needed than in B2C.
Yeah.
And in the B2C world, and we're all about that, right? That's like, it's part of the briefs that the agency writes and, that, goes into all of the content that's created and everything. But why is B2B in need of more emotion than B2C?
Yeah. I think part of it is if we index, so if we go to the beginning of the marketing discipline, there's performance, there's growth, and then there's brand, right? In B2B, there tends to be a little bit more, we lean more toward the performance and the growth, which is great. And it responds to a lot of reasons, and there's a reason why. But because of that, brand takes a little bit of a backseat. I kid you not, I not too long ago had a conversation with a CFO, and of course it's a CFO, but the questions were like, what's the ROI on brand? Why should we necessarily dedicate or allocate these resources to brand if it's not going to render as much, as direct a result as, I don't know, some sort of campaign, some sort of, Google ad or what have you. So why should we pay attention to brand? Again, it starts at the top. I think a lot of CEOs and founders need to understand, or at least need to be open to the idea of why brand is important. There's a data point that is interesting to me, and I kind of keep it in the back of my mind. 21% of founders and CEOs understand and say that they want their brand to mean something, and that the customer base is expecting to say something. 86% of customers expect the brands to mean something. So there's a disparity that's enormous. So again, from the top, there needs to be an understanding how brand is important. So now that we go back to the T, performance and brand, I think brand is the nascent element of a lot of the content and a lot of the positioning that will help fuel growth, right? So I think brand needs to be as present, if not more. But one of the rationales as to why brand in B2B environments can take a little bit of a backseat is because we think that it's all rational. Right. It's a business need, it's pricing, it's integration. Right. A lot of it is just this logical approach to the usefulness and the merit of a product rather than the significance of its brand. And so not too long ago, I believe earlier this year, Google put out a study, and there is B2B purchases are as emotional, if not more, than B2C purchases. And so when you say, why do they need it more? I think they need it more because they've never considered that we needed it as much as B2C. So in B2C, it was implied. With B2B, it was like, well, maybe. Right. And so now we're finding out that indeed, it's a very emotional purchase. And it's an emotional purchase is because I think one of the things that we often forget is that once we've established the conversation for a possible sale of B2B, whether it's a SaaS solution, what have you, there's a lot of internal selling. So whether it's procurement, IT, whoever's going to be the primary user of that tool almost becomes a brand ambassador internally. So that person becomes really invested in making sure that it's sold, that it comes through, that the people internally, whoever the CFO, whoever makes those bigger decisions of buying, they believe in the product. So you become way more invested. The price point usually, and the terms of it, the term sheet is longer term, right? It's a year, 2 years, 3 years. There's a bunch of seats. So all that's included in the term sheet just makes it a way higher investment than your more average B2C purchase and transaction. So for all those reasons, it actually becomes a way more invested transaction, and emotion takes a huge part. And going back to the beginning of our conversation, I think it's something that we tend to forget, partially because and you said it before, in a company, we tend to believe so much and tell ourselves how great we are that we sometimes don't necessarily feel the need to persuade potential customers as to why we're great. We already think we're great. So we appeal to the rational and to that list of features rather than the emotion. And I think that is one of the other big differences between B2C and B2B.
And I think, one of the things too is that a B2B purchase, there is the emotional risk of making the wrong decision, right? Because you're making big purchases and it has a potential to have a very big impact on the company.
Yeah.
If you're talking about the purchase of tennis shoes or a purse or, even a car, I mean, that's not going to ruin your family, right? But your career can be on the line. The whole adage, nobody,
gets
went
fired.
wrong buying IBM, right?
Yeah.
Kind of thing. So in terms of, because there's that higher kind of emotional risk factor, how does that play then into how you market a B2B company and in how we learn from B2C, which pays attention to that every day?
Yeah. So it goes back to, if we consider marketing a team of performance and growth on one side and brand, is that dedication to brand. And to me, that dedication to brand means, are we understanding what position, what parcel do we play and do we own in this marketplace? And what's the story we're telling behind that? Like what is it that, are we a commodity brand, or why are we different? Is something we need to align on. We have to be self-critical from the top, from the CEO down. What is it that, what are our strengths, weaknesses? What can we do better? Own those, and with that, develop the positioning and the value proposition to be unique and own that. And then the storytelling has to be embedded in each touch point. Again, I can't tell you, I've already too many to count, moments where I see an acquisition play or campaigns or messaging to the outside world from a company. And then as you start traveling through the customer experience, through that welcome call, through that sales call, through that webinar, through that onboarding call, whatever that is, that initial promise is gone. That initial promise is, again, it's either assumed or it's just not part of the speech because we don't feel that we need that. But going back to emotion, you need to reaffirm and validate the purchase, and then stay true to that positioning throughout the user experience and the value chain. So I think that's something that it's a much more dedicated discipline within B2C than necessarily B2B. And before B2B fellow CMOs kill me, this is not a rule necessarily, but because of how fragmented and how a little bit more complex it is in the B2B world, why it's often forgotten, right? But it's also a result of CEOs and founders. They are usually pressured both by ambition and possibly funding to go after scale, to grow, right? It's almost at all costs, right? Hardcore. So I think that has to start at the top with the understanding of what brand means, what resources and dedication it needs to, it merits, and then the impact of it. That's our job, to show the impact and the benefit that it could garner throughout the customer experience.
You said something in there that I want to ask you more on, which is, you talked about, because of the risk factors, the more complex emotional component to the B2B purchase, you talked about the validation process, right? Because that's the tire kicking on the B2C side, right?
Yeah.
But we as the company are the sellers, right? So our point of view is important, and it's got to be unique, right? And it's got to be interesting. But if it's not validated by the outside world, it's our word. It becomes super powerful if we are perceived as bringing the voice of the peer community of our, ICPs, the industry, the thought leaders together around this is actually where the trend is going in the industry. This is what, for your ICP, the more modern CFO or the more modern, CTO or whoever your ICP is doing and why.
Yeah.
Right. And so that validation is really super important. And you brought it up there, and I just wanted to, that's always been my takeaway on that.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to make sure that, that part wasn't underrepresented in your point that you were making, because validation is super important.
It is. And it's funny that you say kick the tires, because it immediately takes us right to a very familiar industry. So it's easy to illustrate the example, but so in the car category, you have Volvo, Toyota, which are reliant, safe. Then you have Mercedes, or you have like BMW that are more performance or luxury based.
Right.
But it's always been interesting to me, go to the dealership, and then in the dealership, especially for a really high, high price point, luxury, performance-based car or car brand, it should equate that level of sexiness or that level of aspiration that you saw on the advertisement, right? So whatever you're trying to communicate, that has to be reaffirmed at every touch point. And it's incredible that at times, even in those dealerships, you'll walk back when it's finally time to sign. You'll walk back to a small office that is very brightly lit, sort of like a dentist office. The whole thing should be about, you just made a purchase to feel sexy, drive faster, what have you, right? Which was the initial aspiration. And similarly, it should apply for the most part to that same process in B2B, where at every touch point, you should be affirming why they're buying, why they're making this decision, why are they here, why is this the better solution or the better, the better option in the marketplace, and then stay consistent to that promise. Not necessarily, from bells and whistles, but at least from a messaging standpoint, it needs to stay consistent. And oftentimes, because a B2B environment is much more fragmented, right? The voice of the customer who owns that could be more on the success side, sales. Sales takes a bigger seat. So, and it's just not to, they have a tough job. But ownership of that process and then that consistency of message needs to be, it's why the figure of the CRO came about, right? At some point, there had to be somebody that made sure that to the degree that we can be integrated in that process. And in comes the CRO figure.
Well, I want to make sure that I have time to ask you a last question. And
yes, sir.
The question is, all of this that we're talking about, marketing a lot is a function of the creation of content that is then shared. And correct. I just wanted to ask your opinion on something, and I'm going to pin you to the wall in terms of an answer here. Why? If I said on a scale of 1 to 10, how important is content to a B2B organization in terms of the overall growth and success of the company? 1, it's not important at all. 10, it's actually vital to the overall growth and success of the company. Where would you put it on that rating scale, and why?
Because I'm pragmatic and I understand that there's context. So it's, the life cycle of a company, et cetera, for a variety of reasons. I'll be, I'll stay conservative on my response, which will be an 8. Okay. Otherwise, all things equal, I would say a 10. I think content is critical. But depending on some things, it could be, the quality of the product, the delivery, the reliability on it, and so on.
All has to be important. Right.
But yeah, content is essential, I think, in both the expression of the brand, but also in influencing the organization internally in the delivery of that value proposition. So the way I see it is content, the adherence and dedication of a company to content becomes a muscle in the company, becomes a muscle internally, in which everybody, every salesperson, copywriter, everybody within the company slowly starts developing that storytelling muscle, and it becomes then easier and more of a commonality and a common practice to be consistent in our messaging. When you meet different people, everybody should make this. You should do this exercise with any company that they transact with, which is, what is the value proposition? And then most of the time you'll ask 10 people and you'll get 10 different answers. Right. Rare is the company, but also amazing is the company that at least gives you a relative consistency on all 10 responses, right? And that's because they have dedicated and they have made a concern of theirs to tell the same story, to say who they are, why they're here, why they're better.
I have never heard of it, and I've spent my entire career in marketing. I love the analogy of kind of the muscle of content marketing, right? Yeah. And that this reflex that happens, like the more that the story is told, the better the story is told, the better that customer success is going to tell it, that sales is going to tell it, that marketing is going to keep retelling it, right? And here's the visual that I got. I have a son it's called Krav Maga. It's defensive martial arts. And he says, Dad, if I ever got into like a fight, like somebody tried to attack me, she goes, all the things that I'm learning are just going to naturally happen, right? He's done it with repetition so many times that he's got this muscle memory that will kick into gear. And I love that analogy of telling that story, telling it well internally, because we think about storytelling and content as an external, really kind of like, that's our job, right? But internal marketing and telling that story so that everyone is consistent, and no matter whether it's on a webinar, it's on a sales call, no matter where that touch point is happening on a white paper, that storyline has to all go through there. And the company has to develop its muscle memory in order to tell it and tell it well and tell it consistently. So
interesting.
I love some of the analogies that you brought towards us here today.
Let me make one last point and give an example, because the figure.
Oh, that'd be great.
And it's interesting because we're going through this. Well, maybe it'll end soon, but there's a writer strike in Hollywood, and it's impacting everything: television, streamers, and so on. But are writers important or not? In a company, and in a B2B company, but all companies, you have a copywriter or two or three or whatever. But the figure of the copywriter is usually seen as part of that machine within marketing. So my point around content is both, to illustrate it, is to both honor that role, because that role is really integral in crafting the voice, the tone, the messaging. But it goes both ways. I've often in my career, when I speak to, or when I'm meeting with my creative teams, it is not uncommon for me to call out, say, the copywriter or designer, and ask them about the business. How are we doing on sales? How are we doing versus the competition, and so on? It is just as important for me to know that they are at least understanding of where we are on the business, and not just on writing another blog post. Like it has to be a symbiotic relationship. And so if we do that correctly, then the role, the job, and the product that the copywriter, designers, that the creative team puts out becomes a lot more impactful internally in the company. And so I think that's I think that's critical to both honor and respect the discipline of marketing and the creative aspect, but also its impact within the company. It's a lot more than just put another blog post. And at times, I'm afraid that it's looked at that way. And so I think it's really more of a muscle. And if we pay attention to it, it really does embed something that a copywriter who knows how to write, who knows the right words, can say, will deeply influence your average sales executive, and the way they speak to and they present the company. So it does filter and sip through the whole company. if you honor that role and really pay its give its due to content creation.
Well, Polo, I know we could talk another couple hours here.
Right. Indeed.
But what I want to do is I want to make sure that if people had a follow-on question, is the best way to get hold of you on LinkedIn? Would that be a good
through LinkedIn. I'm Polo Aristoy. I'm in Texas, and yeah, I love talking about this. It really is interesting to me because, like the human condition, everybody does it a different way. So often, figuring out why they do it a certain way is interesting. So this is, like you said, we can talk a few more hours on this. This is great.
Well, thank you for coming on and sharing the highlights of the insights that you have. Incredible background, right? A Nielsen analyst, the B2C side, the B2B side. So thank you for sharing all that you did.
Thank you. Thank you. I really want to thank you for the time, and everybody that listens. If I can ever be of help, let me know.